Good afternoon, it's Friday the 24th of November 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. We're also going to be joined today by David Scott, bringing us northern exposure from north of the border, but also Ian Crane with an update on what's been happening in the courts in respect of fracking. But we've got some really astonishing things starting to unfold in UK and Europe. Very dangerous, Mike.
Well, the Eastern Partnership, Brian, here's the little video that the European Union has pushed out today. It's a first. The 2017 Eastern Partnership Summit takes place in Brussels today. Leaders from Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine are going to meet the EU 28, so that includes Britain. So Theresa May is heading over there. She is attending. She says that she's going to set out her commitment for the UK to continue to play a critical role in European security after the UK leaves the EU. We'll talk about this a bit more in a moment. We're apparently going to provide £50 million this financial year to support reform and security in the sort of former Soviet republics through projects like tax reform in Moldova, demining in Ukraine, and also spending £100 million in the eastern neighbourhood to counter disinformation, Brian, because what they need more than anything else is to be told what the truth is.
Well, Michael Gove's been particularly hot on that, and we'll come on to that a little bit later.
So Eastern Partnership Summit 2017 going on at the moment. There are 20 key deliverables for 2020, and these strengthen the cooperation that in the so-called 4 priority areas. So that was agreed in the Riga conference in 2015. They're talking about a stronger economy, better economic development, better market opportunities, stronger governance, strengthening of institutions and good governance, stronger connectivity, enhancing interconnections, notably in the area of transport and energy, and stronger society, increasing mobility and contacts between people. So basically what's going on here is that what they're doing is getting these countries reformed in the European model, ready for them joining the European Union at some future date. And of course, not listed on the 20 deliverables, but in another document, participation by at least 3 partner countries in the EU's common security and defence operations, and enhancement of training initiatives focused on common security and defence issues. So absolutely common security and defence right at the heart of this, Brian. And let's just, we'll have a look at a couple of the sort of tweets that have been pushed out. This is from the President of Georgia, started Brussels visit with meeting with Donald Tusk. Thank you for your cooperation and support in implementing government GEO's that's the Georgian government's ambitious reform agenda.
Reform,
absolutely.
Change, transformation.
And of course, the Georgian government meeting with the Ukrainian government, because that's what this is all about, getting these partnerships going, getting the networks built for these countries to join the European Union at a future date. The Eastern Partnership says, well, actually, this was a bit strange because this quote, the Eastern Partnership is one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives of the EU, is both from the Polish and the Swedish foreign ministers. So that's all good news, Brian.
Of course, it's not good news, Mike. EU driving into the Eastern European underbelly. What we've got to remember is it will be the European Union so-called non-government organisations that will be in picking up the action. And somebody's pointed out to us, of course, it's EU initiatives like Erasmus, which is desperately trying to squash youth together, get rid of their national identity and get them into one EU nation state. This is very dangerous. But if you think that's dangerous, let's move on to Theresa May. And the BBC article here headlining Theresa May to warn of hostile Russia threat to EU security. Of course, that is not the real headline. When you read the commentary in this article, what came straight into my head, Mike, was Operation Barbarossa. which was, of course, the Nazi German invasion of Eastern Europe and the attack on Russia. What is this woman talking about? Exactly the same things, with an eye on Eastern European grain. I've put in there oil as well, and technology. And if we think about this, what we've got here is the British Prime Minister driving for war in Eastern Europe. And who's she going to be sacrificing? Well, British Army, British Armed Services, just about gone at the moment. So she's going to be taking the lives of young Poles, and particularly young Germans, that are going to be taken up in the European unified military structure. So this is the Conservative drive for war on the Eastern Front.
So let's look at what she is going to say. From agriculture in Ukraine to the tech sector in Belarus, there's a huge amount of potential in the eastern neighbourhood that we should nurture and develop. But we must also be open-eyed to the actions of hostile states like Russia, which threaten this potential and attempt to tear our collective strength apart. The UK may be leaving the European Union. Is that may, as in possibly not? Yeah, the UK may be leaving the European Union, but we're not leaving Europe, and we are unconditionally committed to maintaining Europe's security.
That's the word, unconditionally. There is no movement away from EU security. She is part of the unified EU military structure.
So I thought we would just look at this tweet from Aaron Banks this morning, because I think that's quite timely. He says, what's the first thing you do with a new army? Of course, he's talking about the new European unified army. You have a war, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, in the meantime, the Russians not taking this lying down. So Putin was hosting a Russian Defense Ministry meeting yesterday. This is continuing a series of meetings with senior officials from the Defense Ministry and the defense industry. He basically saying, well, let's have a look and see what he had to say. He was talking about Zapad 2017, which of course was this military exercise in Russia, which was driving Western nations absolutely nuts. The exercise has exposed certain shortcomings. We must analyse them so as to propose additional measures to enhance mobilisation readiness. He said the economic ability to increase the production of defence products and services quickly is a vital element of military security. All strategic companies, regardless of the type of ownership, must be able to do this. So he's talking already about Russian companies being able to ramp up production of arms and material, Brian. So the Russians not taking this situation lying down?
Absolutely not. And what must the Russians be thinking at this point, where we have the British Prime Minister using language very close to Nazi Germany, before their attack on Russia? It's quite remarkable times. And we've lost one of the...
Well, David Scott has just dropped off. We will try and get him back on in a second. So we'll change the order slightly and we'll go to the eviction that took place yesterday, Brian.
Okay, let's come in for that. So first of all, a very big thank you. Let's just move through some of our images here. Let's come in with the Plymouth eviction, and we'll start with an image of the police car here. Now, the background to this case is that a lady has been fighting, a widow has been fighting to keep her house after what she says is a fraudulent court, a series of fraudulent court hearings where an ex-partner has attempted to gain part possession of her house. And this has escalated over the years to recent events where she had to go to Devon and Cornwall Police, and indeed they raised a crime number on the court proceedings that this lady is complaining about. So despite the fact there was a crime number in place with regard to the attempted eviction of this lady from her house, bailiffs turned up yesterday. I attended with other people. This was the police car soon after it arrived, soon after we arrived. And there's the police at the top of the hill on the way to the house in question. So here we are, Plymouth Widow's house. This is Julia Langmaid's house at the centre of the attempted eviction. And the little inset arrow there is pointing out that she's got a variety of notices posted on her window, giving people details of the crime numbered court case. Can I keep coming back to this fact that there is a crime number? So what are we talking about? Not an ordinary eviction, but an attempted eviction with a crime number on the whole of the court case in place. Let's have a look at this little video clip showing the start of the bailiff's attempted eviction.
Hi, thank you. Cheers, sir.
Thank you. Cheers.
Sorry, can I just have a knock? Thank you. Sorry, excuse me a second. I want to shout through the letterbox if that's all right with you. Sorry, you are? Right, excuse me then, please.
Private. You don't have to move. I've got no legal obligation to you.
Well, you shouldn't be on the property.
What you're doing is you shouldn't be speaking to me. Breaching my peace. I don't need to speak to you. I don't need to know who I am. You shouldn't be on the property either.
I think you'll find I've got a warrant.
And what's a warrant?
Sorry, I don't really want to speak to you.
There you go then. That's exactly what's my point. Don't breach my peace.
So there we are. The bailiffs arrived with a warrant which is trying to be imposed or served while a crime number on the whole background of this case is in place. This is quite remarkable stuff. Let's just follow on with some of the images we were able to take. This is the rear of the property, and we had more peaceful supporters there who were making sure that the locksmiths weren't going to get in through that back door. And at this stage, there was a sort of Mexican standoff because what was happening was a very deep discussion with the police and the bailiffs, and also a solicitor who was present. The dark-haired lady is a solicitor. It was very noticeable that the whole police attention was on the bailiffs and this solicitor, and despite the fact, of course, that there was a crime number which Devon and Cornwall police had themselves raised for this whole case. So we don't know what was discussed there. They spent quite a lot of time hunched behind this van, and I've put here that the police clearly show bias by their secret discussions with the bailiffs, and eventually they leave with the bailiffs and the solicitor without any further explanation to Mrs. Langmaid, the widow, or the public. So it's quite extraordinary. The police are there, hands in pockets, but they're discussing with the bailiffs and the solicitors the case, but there is a crime number on this case. So presumably if the police had allowed the bailiffs into the property again, the police would have been aiding and abetting a crime.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. We decided we'd just sort of score Devon and Cornwall police, so let's do that. First of all, both the police constables, the man and the woman, were smart, albeit they're in a rather intimidating black uniform. But basically they were generally polite, and they certainly remained calm and I would say professional. So we're going to say well done for that. Both constables understood that their role was to keep the peace, but they were in constant mobile contact seeking advice. So they were very unsure about the situation, and there was several calls, obviously, back to base to find out what they should be doing. We've got here that basically neither of the two constables seemed to understand that they'd attended an attempted eviction based on a court case for which Devon and Cornwall police had already raised that crime number. They just didn't register that, and if you mentioned it, they just said, we're here to keep the peace. Both the constables were heavily focused, as we've said, on the bailiffs and the attending solicitor, rather than the widow, who had been forced to seek the help of Devon and Cornwall police in protecting her home. This is the interesting spin. Were the police there to protect the public or the bailiffs? Both constables left the attempted eviction scene without any proper dialogue with the frightened lady victim or the public present. And then I'm going to end by saying many of the people present regarded the police as unfairly biased towards the bailiffs. So that's the situation. We're going to say a very big thank you to all of the people who turned up, because it was your presence, polite, respectful, very calm, that clearly stopped this eviction. So it goes to show, one, that we have some pretty extraordinary things happening in the courts. Two, our police seem to be biased in favour of bailiffs. But three, when the public stand up to be counted in the right way, we can achieve some measurable results.
Right now, we're going to stay on the same type of subject, but yesterday there was a court case took place in which Ineos was attempting to extend its injunction on the protests and the anti-fracking protection community. This was a pretty draconian injunction that they had in place, where basically they're saying that if you take part in any protest, whether that be a physical protest at a fracking site or whether that be a protest online in social media and so on, that potentially your assets would be at risk, your liberty would be at risk, and so on. So this court hearing took place yesterday, and parts of the injunction were upheld and extended, and parts of it were thrown out. And so to start this off, before we bring Ian Crane in to talk about this, we're going to have a look at a few comments from Joe Corrie, who was one of the people involved in the court case. So let's see what Joe had to say, his feedback on what took place in the court yesterday.
My immediate reaction is, you know, we've won some important points, and yet there is lots more to do. So I think people have to remember that Ineos initially took this injunction out in secret, a secret hearing at the end of July. They knew everyone was on holiday and it was a quiet time, and they thought they were going to come back at the beginning of September and have this thing stamped into permanent law, 7 years law. That didn't happen then. Then we had the 3-day hearing, and the interim injunction has continued. The interim injunction has continued today. From when they got the injunction in the first place, you have to remember that Ineos boasted, and were boasting, that it was the widest injunction of its kind ever, right? What we've managed to cut off today is all of the harassment stuff, because it's clear that if somebody's coming to your town or village and going to destroy your environment and your way of life, telling those people that you don't like what they're doing is not harassment, you know. And I think that, so, you know, previously the injunction included posting anything, communicating with anyone on social media in their supply chain, saying anything they didn't like, talking to their staff in a way they didn't like, all of that sort of stuff, helping people to protest, driving them there, giving them a cup of tea, encouraging them. All of that has been thrown out. The parts and the difficult parts that remain are the infringements on our right to protest, slow walking, locking on,
lorry surfing,
those types of things, which are effective, very effective tools in slowing down this monstrous killer industry. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag, and I think that's what we were expecting. And we now have 2 weeks to be able to really consider in detail what the judgment says, and to then come back and put our case for an appeal. The biggest problem here, Ian, really, if we really think about it, is the whole idea of secret courts in themselves. That's the big problem. It was something that Treason May brought in when she was in the Home Office. And this is precisely a clear example of what could happen, what people were saying was wrong with that decision at the time, all dressed up about the terrorist threat and everything else. You know, if you think about it, you know, the people of Lancashire democratically voted to kick fracking out. They didn't want it there. It was forced on them by a government minister who overruled them, Savage Javid or Greg Clark or one of those arseholes, you know, that came and said, you know, you're going to have it anyway. So what have those people got left to do if they don't have a right to protest, if posting something on social media gives them a 2-year prison term? I mean, this is what's going on, right? And this is why people need to stand up, they need to talk to their MPs. The Labour Party need to get involved and stop talking and start acting, actually.
Well, Ian, let's bring you in at this point. Welcome to the programme. I guess you're up at Kirby Misperton at the moment.
I am, and it's an absolutely glorious day. And as you'll notice, the background, which isn't green screen, this is genuine background, but it's a clear blue sky, and you don't see too many of them these days, do you?
No, indeed. So just give us your thoughts on what happened yesterday. Joe has given us his. At the end of the day, this injunction was initially established in a secret court. Joe was absolutely right to highlight that as being the major risk that we face at the moment.
Absolutely, and of course, had the two Joes, Joe Corry and Joe Boyd, not stepped forward to challenge it, then on September the 12th, the judge would have simply rubber stamped that injunction into law. And as you heard Joe Corry say, one of the most draconian parts of that was it literally meant that anybody who criticised Ineos on social media effectively was in breach of the injunction, in contempt of court, and not only risked their liberty, but literally also potentially put their assets at risk if Ineos perceived that they had been caused loss by that comment being posted on social media. And this, of course, is one of the fundamental definitions of fascism, where, you know, the state literally controls what everybody thinks and doesn't tolerate dissent. And of course, here what we have is the corporation, literally, and it's a foreign corporation. It's Ineos, which is registered in Switzerland, although it's headed up by a guy called Jim Ratcliffe, who was ironically educated about 50 miles south of here at Beverley Grammar School. But this is a foreign company that has a very, very interesting corporate structure that's extremely tax efficient, to put it mildly. Jim Ratcliffe has a personal wealth of reportedly of in excess of £5 billion. And here he is effectively trying to buy British law by bringing this injunction to court. And the two Joes, by stepping up to this plate and put forward a very, very robust challenge. And yesterday's ruling, whilst obviously it's not the desired outcome, but it has removed that restriction on social media. I mean, had that been in place, we could probably not be having this conversation right now without both of us risking being held in contempt of court. What is left in place, though, is this injunction against any form of protest beyond sort of standing in a designated free speech zone, which we've already challenged in the courts earlier this year in Manchester, where Quadrilla tried to establish the protest pen. But what Ineos have done, and it doesn't affect us here yet at Kirby Misperton, because this is not an Ineos site, it's Barclays Bank, operating under the guise of Third Energy. But, you know, what it means is that wherever Ineos are looking to establish a presence, and they own, or they have licenses across 1.2 million acres right across the north of England. And as I observed on my live stream earlier this morning, some 13 million people live in or close to effectively an Ineos license. So this is really something that people need to take account of, whether or not they're motivated by getting involved in the anti-fracking campaign. But this potentially has ramifications across any form of dissent against the corporate agenda. Now, it's not over yet, and I gave Justice Morgan the benefit of the doubt this morning, because I said that, you know, frankly, I do hold the court in contempt. I think the decision yesterday was contemptible. But nonetheless, there is 2 weeks for the two Joes to lodge their appeals, and those appeals will be made. And I know for a fact that you know, there's every intention of taking this, you know, right the way through to Strasbourg, if that avenue remains open, because this is absolutely fundamental to what we perceive to be the democracy. But as we all know, that's fast being eroded.
Right. So, I mean, you've part answered this question, because my thoughts on this were, how far does this extend? At this point, this is an injunction. Ineos is a party to this, so this only applies to Ineos sites, but other this sets a precedent of some kind, and other companies can then use this to establish their own injunctions in the future. Is that the case?
That's absolutely the case. And fortunately, because obviously it is still, you know, subject to appeal, I don't think at this juncture the other companies like Barclays, Third Energy, Quadrilla, iGas, etc., I don't think they'll have the motivation to initiate their own attempt to get their own injunction. If they did, frankly, I mean, it would be challenged immediately. But let's just hypothetically say that Ineos take a 10% interest in these other companies across the north of England, then potentially it could be argued that that Ineos injunction applies to all of those companies. And one of the things that Ineos were trying to do yesterday was they were trying to cover every one of their suppliers And initially, they didn't even want to provide a list to the judge. They just basically said, well, anybody who we're doing business with or potentially doing business with should be covered by the injunction. Unfortunately, Justice Morgan said, well, actually, you know, that seems like you're trying to get me to write a blank check. And he said, you know, I've never done that in my private life, and I'm not about to start doing it in my courts. So fortunately, he threw that out, and he's helped us, because what he has demanded is that Ineos actually provide a list of their suppliers. Thank you very much, because now we don't have to hunt around or wait for the trucks to roll. We can just go to the Ineos website, because they have to publish their list of suppliers that are covered by this injunction. Well, of course, then it gets interesting as well, because if those suppliers, let's say, are blockaded, then Ineos may argue that this is in breach of their injunction. But then Ineos are going to have to prove that the trucks that are actually blockaded were going to an Ineos site. So, you know, this is opening up some very, very grey areas. And I can categorically assure Justice Morgan, Ineos, and anybody else that's thinking about this, that we've already, over the last 24 hours, brought more creativity to this than you could ever begin to imagine. And we are really looking forward to challenging this injunction in just about every way you could possibly imagine, and quite possibly that some haven't even crossed your mind yet.
Okay, and sorry, just briefly, Ian, just briefly if you could. Joe mentioned the Labour Party. Are the Labour Party, and in fact any of the other sort of environmentalist NGO types, Friends of the Earth and so on, are they concerned about this?
Well, I have to say that, I mean, Friends of the Earth, and one individual in particular, Simon Bowens, who's a full-time employee of Friends of the Earth up here in the north of England, has been incredibly supportive towards the anti-fracking campaign. Greenpeace, well, you know, do they still exist? I have no clue. But you know, their contribution to the anti-fracking campaign has been pretty much non-existent. So there are NGOs that are taking an interest, but they absolutely need to really take a look here, because if this injunction is upheld, then effectively they become completely ineffectual and completely sidelined. And for some of them, of course, that will be devastating, because they'll lose their revenue streams.
Okay, Ian.
Yeah. I just wanted to come in there and say it's quite remarkable, isn't it? We've begun the news today by pointing out that Theresa May is effectively using the language of the Nazi Party in looking at Eastern Europe for spoils. Quite unbelievable. And here you are talking about the rise of a fascist state in UK with the suppression of free speech. These things cannot be accidental. We're starting to see this brutal Conservative government act in a way we really haven't seen in this country before. And the Labour Party at the moment is doing absolutely nothing. Just 10 seconds.
To be fair, Labour have stated categorically that if they get into power, then they will effectively put a ban, or at least a moratorium in readiness for a ban on fracking. So, you know, that is their stated party position. But, you know, I think, look, you know, the reality is that what we're seeing is that the government and the courts believe that the British people are so either uninterested, they're dumbed down, or so debt-ridden that they actually don't care, and that this can just go on around them. And, you know, there is a generation that is finding its feet in activism again, if it had them in the first place. But, you know, it is perhaps no surprise that the average age of the anti-fracking community is probably well into its 60s, because these are people who know fine well that the only way the government will ever listen, or the courts will ever listen, is if people actually stand up and say, you know what, enough's enough. If you just sit back and let them ride roughshod over you, then unfortunately the prognosis is not pretty.
That's absolutely correct. Thank you very much for that, Ian. Really excellent report, very disturbing.
Okay, shall we move on? Thanks, Ian. Let's move on to this, Brian.
Right, okay. Now we've got a small technical problem at the moment in that we've lost David Scott. We're attempting to get him back on. So I'm just going to talk about some of his slides, and hopefully David will be able to come back and take us through it in more detail. But this is very, very interesting. This is research work where people are starting to look at the reason why school teachers are leaving the profession. And in a very detailed analysis, they're talking about the change in the whole management structure of education. Of course, the word leader we've seen coming in repeatedly, common purpose a major driver of that. But we've also got school teachers working to visions. And what this paper is talking about is that this new agenda is alienating teachers with traditional views and indeed traditional ways of teaching pupils. David, I can see you on screen. Hopefully we can hear you. Tell us a bit more about this.
Yes, it's a remarkable paper. The synopsis really covers it very well. He goes and talks about the use of a book called Good to Great. Now, this is very similar to something else we've seen in Scotland, where modern management ideas have been imported from industry, brought into government, but subtly changed and kind of corrupted as they came in. So the named person in the whole agenda with children is using techniques from total quality management, but the children become the product and the whole thing becomes very dark. Here the book is Good to Great, which is an excellent book, and it looks at corporations in America, a small number who managed to make this leap to have very top level performance financially over a very prolonged period. And the book looks at what the common denominators are in the management structures and leadership styles in those companies. Now that's been taken and there's an attempt to bring this very top level commercial management idea into schools, and it becomes again slightly twisted. And rather than getting the right people on the bus, which is one of the quotes in the book, they talk about getting the wrong people off the bus. So you get this culture of fear where professionals, teachers, have to go along with the management speak, with the new culture that's been brought in. Otherwise, they become a problem. They get thrown off the bus or under the bus, and you start getting this very oppressive internal management structure. Now, this paper really doesn't mince its words. It goes on to say that they've developed techniques from Hannah Arendt's work in political thinking and the analysis of totalitarianism. And they conclude that the paper examines how through the routine practices, quoting here, through routine practices, current models of school leadership enable totalitarian practices to become ordinary. And that's a hugely striking.
This is totalitarianism being drifted in through policy, coming in through schools, but we're seeing it in other places, David. We're certainly seeing it coming in through the NHS. And I had a very interesting conversation with a male social worker a few days ago who was talking about the immense change in the social work profession, the constant turbulence and change, the transformation of their work, immense pressure. And he was also saying that if you spoke out about these changes, then the system simply turned on you as if you were a traitor to the wider regime. This is very deep, sinister stuff. And I know that... Sorry,
exactly. So I'm hearing exactly the same thing from the NHS. People are saying that this is the culture and that the qualities and skills and 30, 40 years of practical experience to bring are just not wanted, and they feel it's an alien organisation. And this paper charts us through political interventions. The Blair government merits a special mention. And they look at what the regulators, Ofsted, etc., are actually doing and plotting the changes there. And they note that it goes from encouraging the management within schools to promote excellence. And then the language changes, and it's now that they've got to relentlessly promote excellence and change. There is this never-ending demand on the management structure. The management is assessed on how relentless they are.
Yeah. David, now we've got, following on from that, we've got this extraordinary story of what's been happening in Canadian universities when people don't use the right pronouns in front of their students. Tell us about this, please.
This is the same thing. This shows that this problem is not a British problem or a European problem. It's worldwide. It's certainly all over the Anglosphere. Now, this was the now famous Jordan Peterson, who objected to coerced speech. There's a bill called Bill C-16, which is now law, which meant that to refuse to use someone's pronoun, which might be a made-up word like ze or they, and refuse to call someone this made-up word would see you before the Ontario Human Rights Commission, who can fine you, who would fine you, and if you refuse to pay the fine, then you would go to jail. So he was highlighting that they were coercing speech, making people use made-up, just invented words in order to control what they say and hence how they think. And this was back to the full force of law. Now, the example here, and this comes to the totalitarian mindset that we looked at just a moment ago, was that the debate, which was publicly aired on TV, sort of prime time mainstream Canadian television, between Jordan Peterson and another professor whose view was that there is no biological difference between men and women, and he maintained that that is the scientific consensus, and Jordan Peterson maintained that it is not. And this debate went on for around half an hour. It's a very interesting piece of television, and it's available on YouTube. There was a teaching assistant in a university in Canada showed a 5-minute clip from this debate as part of a class on communications in contemporary Canada. Well, she was carpeted. She was taken before a committee of 3 inquisitors and given an absolute grilling about why she did this, how wrong it was. She was told she'd...
No, we've still got you. We've still got you.
I'm still live.
Yes.
Okay, the screen's gone black, but I'll keep talking. So she was told that she'd contravened sexual violence policies. She'd been told that she was in a lot of trouble. She was threatened with dismissal. But very fortunately, she also recorded the exchange. She put the recording of this on the internet. It went viral. It shows the university in their true light, and they have come in for.
Oh, we've lost David now. So if we just pop that this one, and this is the one that David is talking about. So the teaching assistant put the recorded audio of her interrogation over this on the internet. It has gone viral, to use that expression, but what this means is that free speech has actually won, because this was the young lady under pressure for challenging the notion that men and women were identical. That's scientific, apparently. They're identical. But she puts out the clip of the interrogation that she suffered, and my goodness, things have changed very quickly. So we've got yet another lesson there, that where people stand up to be counted, this totalitarian regime, which is clearly not just UK, it's worldwide, starts to recoil.
Well, it's funny how things run into each other, because this is another spectacular event in the same vein. We mentioned this a couple of days ago. This is the Geneva Press Club conference taking place on the 20th of November, and Vanessa Bailey is going to be speaking at it alongside Richard Lebevrier and Marcello Ferradanoli, who we've had on this programme. And as you can see there on screen, the Syria campaign very upset about the fact that Vanessa is going to be speaking at this. I'm not quite sure what's wrong with Syria campaign absolutely upset that Vanessa is going to be speaking at this, but not just the Syria campaign, Brian, not just the Syria campaign, because the whole United Nations in Geneva has gone nuts over this. They're talking about nothing else. They're talking about the fact that Vanessa Bailey is going to be speaking at the Geneva Press Club, and they have just gone nuts. But it doesn't end there, because Reporters Without Borders has now gone nuts as well, and they've decided that they're going to boycott this event. This has made it into the local press, into the Geneva Press. Sorry, I didn't mean that to show the text just yet. But basically, the Geneva Press Club has now made a statement in this article about this, and I think it's worth reading it. It says, this is from Guy Metin of the Geneva Press Club. He says, "I've never seen anything like it. An organisation," he's talking about Reporters Without Borders, "an organisation defending press freedom is telling me to censor a conference. This kind of pressure to cancel press conferences usually comes only from countries known to be dictators such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt or Bahrain. This is the first time such a demand has come from an organisation defending journalists from a democratic country. It goes without saying, I will not be following up. That would be to dishonour a profession that I hope you still adhere to. Rather than practice censorship, I propose that you participate in this press conference, as I have also suggested to the White Helmet supporters, and to pose questions that you find are useful for the speakers. For my part, applying the principle of openness and the search for truth is the characteristics, that characterises the press club since its foundation. I'm naturally ready to welcome a press conference with the organisations that support the White Helmets so they can put across their point of view. So far, they have not responded. Regarding the personal attacks that have been levied at our colleague Vanessa Beeley and Mr. Denoli, apologies, they are a shame on journalism. Finally, I am forwarding to you some of the many messages I've received from all over the world supporting the initiative and reassuring me that the freedom of expression is just as under attack among us as under the dictatorships that you claim to denounce. So that was a pretty strong statement from the Geneva Press Club. And I was speaking to Vanessa yesterday, and she says, you know, if anybody would like to write to the Geneva Press Club and offer their support, that would probably be very much appreciated. I think when people take a stand like that, they do deserve to have messages of support from the general public. Absolutely.
This is stunning stuff, Mike, because of course, let's remember the Conservative Party desperate for war in Syria, David Cameron desperate to bomb as much as possible. And now when we've got free speech starting to show all of the devious political manoeuvrings to help topple Assad, my goodness, we got shut down on that free speech. So I hope that we've got overseas viewers today because a UK column on this Friday, the 24th of November, warning that British Prime Minister Theresa May effectively calling for war in Eastern Europe is where she's going. She's got an eye on the resources in Eastern Europe, and it's going to be those young Poles and Germans. Meanwhile, at home, we've got a massive clampdown on free speech, and it is massive. Let's bring in Mr. Gove, because the BBC, of course, picking up on Gove attacking what he describes as distorting social media after animal sentience row. Now, this is all tied in with the EU over the fact that animals can feel emotion and pain. And this is a very interesting article because it's very difficult to see in some ways what it's talking about. So Michael Gove apparently hit out at the way social media corrupts and distorts political reporting and decision making following a row about animal welfare. The Environment Secretary said attacks on MPs over the vote on an EU protocol about animal sentience have been absolutely wrong. I'm not sure how they've been wrong because nobody says that, but that's what Michael Gove says. And he says the Commons vote, it was said the Commons vote sparked protests and a celebrity-backed social media campaign. So let's get into it. Here's Michael Gove. He said on social media, there was a suggestion that somehow the MPs had voted against the principle that animals are sentient beings. That did not happen. That's absolutely wrong. Although the article, Mike, says that that's exactly what happened. The MPs did vote against this. So either the BBC is being slack in reporting or they've written a deliberately confusing article. But he says there's an unhappy tendency now for people to believe that the raw and authentic voice of what's shared on social media is more reliable than what is said in Hansard or on the BBC. This is becoming bizarre, absolutely bizarre. If you do not believe the BBC, then there's something wrong with you, according to the Conservative Party. Well, should we believe the BBC?
Well, absolutely not. And I'm going to remind people about Robert Stewart's blog, Fabricating the BBC in BBC Panorama, Saving Syria's Children. And Robert has now written to the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office about this documentary because some time ago he noticed from a still from the full documentary. By the way, the full documentary is not available to watch because the BBC systematically makes sure that it is taken offline as soon as anybody posts it on a YouTube channel or a Vimeo channel. And the BBC, of course, are not making this documentary available on the BBC website anymore. But he found this still. And basically, I'll just read a few lines from what Robert has written to the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office. He said, I wish to inform you that the above named individuals, and that's ex-BBC reporter Ian Pennell and BBC cameraman Darren Conway, I wish to inform you that the above named individuals apparently established a business relationship with members of a jihadi group with links to Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria in August 2013. At 10 minutes 18 seconds into the 2013 BBC Panorama programme Saving Syria's Children, Mr. Pennell states, Western journalists have been targeted in Syria, so I have to travel with my own security. From 10 minutes 28 seconds to 10 minutes 38 seconds in the programme, the logo of Arar al-Sham is visible, and it's on screen at the moment, is visible on the front of one of the vehicles in Pennell and Conway's security convoy. Now, the key point here is that Arar al-Sham, according to, Wikipedia, okay, you can take what you like out of that, but the fact is, Arar al-Sham aims to create an Islamic state under Sharia law. It has cooperated with Al-Nusra Front. It's an affiliate. It's affiliated to Al-Nusra Front. It is related to ISIS. These groups can't really be separated, even when they sort of tentatively separate and rebrand themselves. The BBC was using jihadists, people that are cutting the heads off other people,
for its own
security in Syria, and apparently proud to be driving around in trucks with Arar al-Sham logos emblazoned upon them.
So this is the same BBC that was using its charity, inverted comma, charity arm, BBC Media Action, which had gone into Syria to help stir up unrest in order to help overthrow Assad. The BBC then goes back in to report on the massive deaths and casualties using the protection of an ISIS vehicle. But Michael Gove believes that we should believe the BBC. Let's bring Michael Gove on again because he had more to say. Parliament is an effective and vigorous institution which can ensure protection for human rights and animal rights. So certainly it's protected human rights in Syria, of course. Animal rights, well, I don't know, we'll come on to that, but we've put in there, except when the Conservative whips are covering up child abuse, because it's on BBC film footage that former Tory whip Tim Fortescue says very clearly that Conservative MPs were coming to the whips with problems to do with little boys. The whips covered it up so those MPs would do as they asked. So Michael Gove lives in that environment, but he would have us believe that Parliament is wonderful. He says the Conservative, the government has made a commitment to animal welfare, to which I've said with the exception of approving Satanist rituals within the British military and covering up investigation of satanic abuse of animals and children. So utter hypocrisy there from Michael Gove. Does his loyalty lie with the British people? I don't think so. But what a news for UK column on the 24th of November. If you appreciate the severity of the news items that we've reported, the danger of the news items we reported today, please share UK column news today because we need to spread the news as to what this very, very dangerous Conservative government is up to. Apologies for the small problems with technology today, happens sometimes, but we will be back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.